Our speaker this evening's a gentleman that I met about 3 o'clock this afternoon, and we had a long little chat, I guess. And as we were sitting down to dinner tonight, he said to me, he said, Ron, are you nervous? And I said, yes, I am. Can you tell? And he said, yeah, you just ate your flower. I know we're all going to enjoy Rayok from Larchmont, New York.
My name is Rayok, and I'm an alcoholic. Nice to be in St. Paul. I am a member of the world-famous Mamaroneck group at Mamaroneck, New York. You've heard of that group, no doubt. I bring you greetings from the Mamaroneck group, and at a recent meeting of our steering committee, I was authorized to wish you a happy weekend. The authorization came from our steering committee, and the vote of the committee was 11-7. I bring you greetings also from my wife, my current wife. I always call her my current wife. I find it keeps her on her toes. My wife would be with us this evening, but she is attending a very super, and I mean super, meeting of her Al-Anon group. You will forgive me, Tony. Her Al-Anon group meets at the Mother Church of all Al-Anon, the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Revenge. I was very relieved when your chairman announced that they were taping this meeting, because I will get a copy of my tape and play it for my group. I want to thank you for the automobile you gave me. Now, let me tell you about my drinking. I don't want you to miss any of this. This is a thrill a minute. This is. I grew up in one of the neighborhoods in New York City, and my neighborhood was rough, and it was tough, and it was Irish. And this will come as a surprise to you in St. Paul, but they drank in that neighborhood. It's a terrible thing for a young boy to see people actually intoxicated right in front of you. If you look at my house, you'd see a little drinking. My mother, the widow O'Keefe, was known to take a drink from time to time. If the pressure got on, Kitty would go for the wine and the light spirits, and something would fly, usually one of the children. My brother Billy, on the other hand, was a very, very bad drinker, and in a neighborhood of Irish drunks, my brother Billy stood out as a drunk. And so when I fell by the local joint and ordered up whatever it was they were serving to 14-year-olds that afternoon, no one paid any attention to me. It was just another O'Keefe coming by, seeming to do what came so naturally to the rest of the family. I really don't even precisely remember what they gave me that day. I suspect it was a beer. That was the neighborhood drink. But whatever it was, I loved it. I liked everything about it. I liked the way it looked. I liked the way it smells. I liked the way it tastes. I liked what it did for my head. I liked the noise and the smoke and the confusion. I liked the fist fights and the Irish music. I liked the bullshit. I really liked that part. I was going through the parochial school system, in a manner of speaking, and I had all of the troubles and travails you might imagine a young man would have going through that system drunk. I was thrown out of high school a record number of times. I held the neighborhood record for being thrown out of high school, a record previously set for my brother Billy. When I was finished with high school, or more properly put, when they were finished with me, because someone made a mistake in a small college up in New England, I got the opportunity to leave the neighborhood, and I was sent north to school. And when I got to college, my drinking changed. In the neighborhood, we drank beer, and we drank shots and beers, and we call those bats and balls. But when I got north, they weren't drinking that way. There were no bars in this state, just restaurants, and you sat at a table, and you drank beer out of a bottle, and you sang college songs, and they wore white shoes in the wintertime. And being a man of no particular moral fiber, I got a pair of white shoes. I learned the words of a few of those songs. I got very collegiate. I was drinking beer out of a bottle. World War II was just about over, and it looked fairly safe, and things were a little slow on the campus anyhow. So one afternoon I went to get a haircut, and I joined the Navy. I ended up in San Francisco on a minesweeper, and I hate to be indelicate at such a gathering, but I have to tell you, I had a lot of trouble with my kidneys when I drank. And in the Navy, we slept 3 to a tier. Now, don't get ahead of me, because it's very difficult there. Stay right with me. And a new man slept on top. So, as you might imagine, I came back from my first liberty in San Francisco, and I had one of those rare nephritis attacks that evening, and I met the guy that slept below me. I suppose he figured he'd be wet sometime in his naval career, but it hadn't occurred to him it would happen while he was sleeping. I was immediately transferred to a lower bunk. One day, this mighty ship of the line, bristling with armament, was floating around in the South Pacific, trying to stay out of harm's way. We were bringing the mail to our fighting men, if you really want to know what we were doing, delivering the mail. The executive officer sent for me, and he told me something I was to hear many, many times in my life, but it never helped me with alcohol. In fact, if anything, it hurt. He said, "You are a very, very smart kid, O'Keefe." And I agreed with him right away. I thought he was beginning to show judgment. He told me that they would allow me to take some examinations, and if I were successful, they would send me to the United States Naval Academy. And so in a matter of months, I found myself in a very fancy preparatory school in Maryland. And I was only there a few months when the executive officer of the school sent for me. His experience was somewhat different than the other man's, apparently, because he threw me out of the school. He said they had rules about people like me who went out through the window and over the fence and came back drunk and started riots. And he suggested that I resign my appointment to the Naval Academy, and he put his suggestion in the form of a written order. So I got packed and got ready to be sent far, far away, but with characteristic military efficiency, I was placed on board the yacht of the President of the United States. I would like to bemuse you with tales of intimacy with the President and my participation in affairs of state. Unfortunately, I have no such report to make. It was the Navy. I got paid, and then I got drunk, and then I waited to get paid, and then I got paid, and then I got drunk, and then I waited to get paid. And that's how I spent the balance of my enlistment. When that was over, I came back home to the neighborhood. Everything was under control in the neighborhood. The widow was out in the weeds somewhere. My brother Billy was over the hill from the New York City Police Department, having invited a citizen of Puerto Rican ancestry off a 5-story roof. The citizen bounced and lived to identify the Irish cop. My brother Billy went west and went into another line of work. The 5220 Club was available for heroes. I qualified for a few checks. I gravitated back to the local joint. I learned a little of the game of shuffleboard, and I was planning a life of petty crime with some of my boyhood companions when I had one of those clear thoughts that flowed in from time to time. I remembered I'd been to college. So I got on a bus and I went back up there, and I arrived in January in the middle of a blizzard, and I walked into the joint, and there they were, sitting around that table, drinking beer out of a bottle, singing those songs, wearing those shoes. So I got another pair of shoes. And now I was really in clover because the government was sending me a check every month And so I got very collegiate and stayed moderately bagged all the time. And one day I was staggering around the campus in my usual shape, and I noticed a list of names on a bulletin board of people who were qualified to graduate, and my name was on the list. And that was good news. I thought I had another year to go. I notified the widow of this great event, and she came north, and that was a rather tender sight. The widow and her youngest child staggering around under the elm. About 10 years later, I served as a trustee of that college, and they were still talking about my mother. It isn't often in the state of Vermont they see a little old lady get off a train drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning. When that was over and I came back home in the fall, the question was what to do, and my uncles, who ran the family, had decided that the vote was unanimous tonight to want a New York City Police Department, because that's what my father had done, that's what my mother had done, that's what my brother had done, and that's what all my uncles and cousins were doing, except for the two dummies who worked for the phone company. And they told me about that, and I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I want to do. I was alcoholic. Alcoholics always do what they want to do. And I told them that I had received a free ride to law school, and I'd be unemployed for the next several years. And that was received with mixed emotions. However, that's what I did. I went to law school. And when I got to law school, my drinking changed again. I had never seen a lawyer before I went to law school. We didn't have any lawyers in my neighborhood. We had cops and we had priests. We didn't need any lawyers. I hate to be disloyal to the profession, but I have to tell you that when I arrived in law school, I found I was in the company of the biggest collection of stiffs that had ever assembled under one roof. These guys were very deadly. They all had a suit with a vest, and they all wore eyeglasses. So you know what I did. After I got the uniform, after I got the vest and the suit, I got a pair of glasses I didn't need. I looked around for someone to play with, someone to drink with. My mother always told me, play with nice boys your own age. Nobody drank in this crowd. They were all studying. They were all grinding away. So I became the biggest grind I ever had in that place. And I didn't drink at all in my first year. And very rarely the next 2 years, except summers when I worked in hotels and got to drink for nothing. As a result, when I came out of law school, I was taken into a large, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Wall Street law firm. They took me on as sort of a resident immigrant. My superiors determined that I ought to be trained as a trial lawyer, and so I was sent very early in the game up to the courthouse in New York City to learn my trade. And I wasn't in the courthouse very long when I discovered that all the wise guys were across the street in a saloon. And so I moved my office into the saloon, and I learned to drink in a different, in a more civilized, a more genteel fashion. Very few members of the profession were knocking down bats and balls where anybody could see them. I discovered scotch in a tall glass with water and ice, and you sip on that. It takes a little while, but it gets the job done. I was introduced to all of the mysteries and all of the ritual that surrounds the very, very dry martini. And to this day, to this minute, my love, my admiration, and my affection for the very, very dry martini is surely one of the greatest cases of unrequited love the world has ever seen. I was so loyal to those things, and they destroyed me. After about a year of this civilizing influence, it became natural in my development that I be married, and I had located a lady, or she had located me. I don't know how those things work. I located Mrs. O'Keefe when I was working in a hotel, and I was a bellhop and she was a guest. And that pretty well characterizes the relationship right now. Ms. O'Keefe is from a totally different background than mine. She was raised on a hill in Westchester County in a large home with devoted parents and servants and a fence and a dog. In a word, her family had a buck. Now, I drank a lot in those days, but I knew what was going on. I will not burden you with details of my wedding day, but I assure you that when the O'Keefes from the Bronx hit the Westchester Country Club, they set a few records. There was only one fight. It was not a particularly good fight. My Uncle Bernie hit a waiter. After that, we settled down and set up light housekeeping, and Mrs. O'Keefe then began to deliver children a rather boring and monotonous type of way, and with a regularity that's known only to the devout Roman Catholics. And sometime after these kids began to appear, I received a phone call one day from the dean of the law school I had attended, and he asked me to come by, and I went to see the dean, and he invited me to become a member of the faculty and to become Professor O'Keefe. And I responded with great alacrity, and there I was, the boy professor. And I knew that I drank too much, so I decided, because of the job, that I would try to control my drinking. I knew I had to do something about it. I was very nervous about the job. I didn't figure there was anything in my background to justify the job, and I was nervous about it. And so I started out to control my drinking. I was then 26 years of age, and I was very unsuccessful in controlling my drinking. But as the years went by, a few years went by, I became secure in the teaching. And so I went back out to drink the way I always wanted to drink. And I only knew, really, the one way to drink. My brother Billy taught me how to drink. I drank until I fell down, or until the place went on fire, or the police arrived to quell the riot, or something. There was no reason. I used to wonder where people were going. I would see them leaving, and I knew we weren't out yet, so And in this period of time, I won't burden you with the details of my material success. You know, if I'm hanging around with Doyle here, I'm a very successful fellow. I moved around in the usual circles and did all of those things that lawyers do when they're on the make. And I served by appointment of our governor in a number of things, and I was in politics hither and yon. And the only thing I look back on now with any degree of satisfaction is I was among a group of people in New York in the very middle 50s who early surrounded the candidacy of a young senator from Massachusetts that you will remember. And in this period of time, too, Ms. O'Keefe and I purchased a large, semi-authentic colonial home in a village called Larchmont, New York, a village which abounds in semi-authentic colonial homes. And we had it up to 5 or 6 kids and a big house and the usual number of motor vehicles and the usual memberships in the usual obscure clubs. And I was teaching and lawyering and politicking. And had you asked me in those days how I was doing, I would have told you I was doing very well. In fact, whether you asked me or not, I would have been delighted to bring to your attention my own version of the American dream. But the truth of the matter was that at this time, at age 34, I had become a terrific daily drunk. And my day would have killed an ordinary man. I used to come to in the morning in that wet bed, because the problem with the kidneys had continued unabated all those years. And I would struggle out of that damp sack, and I would begin my morning calisthenics. My calisthenics were performed kneeling on the floor of a bathroom with my head in a bowl. And I would have all the water running, the water in the shower and the water in the sink and the water in the tub. because I did not want Ms. O'Keefe and all of those little O'Keefes to know that Professor O'Keefe was dying. And I would struggle downstairs in my sincere blue suit with a vest, carrying over my shoulder, much like Santa Claus, a sack of wet laundry, because Ms. O'Keefe told me that the diaper service was for the children, and she did not think a lady of her extreme breeding ought to do the wash of a 34-year-old bedwetter. If you can imagine a man of my stature in the community starting off each day with a load of wash. But once I got my wash out of the way, help was at hand. I used to keep a quart of vodka in the refrigerator. My children call that Daddy's juice. And I would take a few bangs on Daddy's juice, and then the question was, would I throw up in front of all those people? I knew if I lit up a cigarette, it was all over. I would struggle on the train into New York City, and if I got all the way into New York City, help was at hand because the train went to Grand Central. And if you know anything about Grand Central in New York, it's really not a railroad station. It is a collection of saloons connected by tunnels. And I would move around all the tunnels and pop up like a mole here and there and have a... And once I got the repair job done, then I would go to the school, and as soon as I got into that imposing institution, my first thought was, how do I get out of here? And I'd get out, and I'd tear across town to a law office, and I would steal. Every morning I would steal $20. And there's nothing like giving money to a drunk, you know. It's like whole blood. I'd get my 20, and I'd be into a cab, and I'd take off to where I really belonged, to my first parish, the bar down by the courthouse. And by this time, the other lawyers were treating me like a playmate, and I'd run in, and I'd throw up the dough, and I'd buy one, and they'd buy one, and the bartender would buy one, and somebody else would buy one. And maybe we'd conduct a little business, and maybe we'd settle some cases, and maybe we wouldn't, and maybe we'd do something else, and maybe we wouldn't, and maybe we'd eat some lunch, and maybe we wouldn't. But the thing that I would do would be keep drinking. And I had these notions that used to go through my head. I had it figured out that I was particularly brilliant at about 2 o'clock. So I'd schedule all my classes for around then, and I'd zoom up to the school, and I would inflict myself on those poor young men who had come to study at my feet, and I would shortchange them terribly, and then I would be off and running back to Grand Central in order to commute. Now, even though I grew up in the city, I understood the theory of commuting. Commuters are entitled to a drink before they get on the train. So I'd have 10 or 12. And then I would take a train going north. It didn't have to go to Larchmont. North was good enough for me. I saw an awful lot more of Bridgeport, Connecticut than any white man really has to see. But most times I'd get home and I'd bounce off a few walls, and I'd take what was left of Daddy's juice and fill up an old jelly glass some kid had left laying around and ask whether or not anyone would join me in a martini. But I was the only one that drank in that house. I'd have 2 or 3 pops, and then I'd figure whether I'd eat or not eat, depending on my mood. Evenings I would spend in civic endeavor. Civic endeavor, by me, was cracking up the car, or throwing up on some hostess's rug, or playing a little grab-ass with the ladies of Larchmont, and a sorrier-looking crop you have never seen. Most evenings, however, I would just stay home and vegetate, and I'd watch television with one eye like that, trying to get those sets to come together. And I look at the television, and it was marvelous, and I'd go through all of the programming and all of the Late Show and all the rest of it, and I would drink. And my big moment would come when they played the Star-Spangled Banner. And the Marines would go up Mount Suribachi, and the destroyers would come through the water, and they would play that song, And I would sob. Oh, I'd cry and cry. And then I'd go upstairs and wet the bed, and that was it. Now, this is not once in a while. This is every day. Weekends, I would save for binges. And if everybody around me minded their own business, I could get drunk 3 times on Saturday and 3 times on Sunday. Well, as everybody who's ever been married can tell you, while all of this was going on, Mrs. O'Keefe was not entirely silent. From time to time, she would have the temerity to suggest that there was something radically wrong with the way I drank. And I would argue it. I'd say, well, are you crazy? I don't drink that much. I'd say, well, I don't even drink as much as my mother. And she would say, nobody drinks as much. Oh, right out the door. That's a terrible thing you said that. And I'd be gone for a few days. Well, this drove her nuts, and she went to her physician, who, as you might imagine, is an obstetrician. And he could find out nothing the matter with her until she told him that she lived with a drunk. And this explained her condition to him, and he gave her a little message for me. And so she came home to give me this message. And this house we lived in, we don't live there anymore. We had some more children. We childrened ourselves out of that house. That is a polite expression of how we came to move from the house. You got to stay with me now. I'm speeding up right away here. This house had a room in it, was a den, as I could call it. Very nice. It was paneled and all of that. And on the wall of that room, I had erected a shrine. Now, the shrine is not the only saint that you ever heard of, Chaplain. This shrine was to me. And there were pictures of O'Keefe with the greats and the near greats, and there were diplomas and plaques and certificates and mementos of political campaigns and little letters from national figures, all of which proved conclusively that I did not have a drinking problem. And I'd watch the TV with the one eye, and they'd put on a commercial, and I'd look at the wall, and I'd say, you're terrific, and I'd have... So Mrs. O'Keefe came to pay a visit to the shrine this evening, and the message that she brought me was that her doctor, the obstetrician, had diagnosed her husband, the professor, as an alcoholic. I was outraged. And as is my custom, I started off very loud. And my first argument that night was directed to the medical profession generally, and I was against doctors who diagnosed patients without having seen them. I was against that practice. And that took several minutes. Loud minutes. Then I went into high gear, and I asked Mrs. O'Keefe a question to which she has not yet discovered the answer. I asked her what kind of a man became an obstetrician in the first place. And at this point, the conversation was coming downhill at a terrible rate. And then it happened. Now, I don't know how this happened. It happened. And I can't explain to you how it happened. I can't explain to you why it happened. It just happened. I can explain many, many other things to you, and I probably will in the second or third hour of this terrific talk that I am giving here. But I can't explain this one. In the middle of all of this terrible noise that I was creating, I suddenly stopped and admitted to Mrs. O'Keefe, for the first time I had admitted to anyone, that there was at least the possibility that I drank too much sometimes. This was a very serious tactical error, because 3 days later I found myself a prisoner in a mental institution in Stamford, Connecticut. And I was only in that institution a matter of moments when I discovered a very serious architectural deficiency in the building. There was no doorknob on my side of the door. They had sandbagged the old professor. And in addition to these outrageous circumstances in which I found myself, it happened also to be the occasion of my 35th birthday. And I mentioned this to a gentleman in a white coat who was passing by, and I explained to him very carefully that on that day, very day, I had attained age 35, and therefore, under the Constitution of the United States of America, was eligible for the office of President. He urged me not to plan any campaigns. He said there were two other presidents in residence, Washington and Jefferson, that month, I think. And he went away and left me, and so I did for the next week or so all of those warm and wonderful, happy and pleasant things that alcoholics do when they withdraw from alcohol. I shook, and I sweat, and I heaved, and I did everything else interesting that you can think about. And finally I came up for air, and I was then visited by the staff of the hospital. They, of course, were psychiatrists, and the first one in to see me was the head of the hospital, and I would have expected no one less. And he fixed his cool professional glance upon me, and he asked me that question that so many people insist on asking alcoholics. It's such a brilliant line of inquiry. He said, "Tell me, Professor, why do you drink so much?" So I told him. I told him of my wealthy parents. I told him that Momsy and Dada used to travel a lot, and I had been left in the hands of cruel servants who were black. He was very sympathetic, and he left. And about an hour later, one of his colleagues came in, and he asked me the same question. So I told him, after all, one doesn't lie to a professional. I told him of my impoverished youth. I told him of the beatings I had received at the hands of my drunken mother. I even told him about the time my sister Marie stole my rubber duck when I was 2 years old. He told me that I had come to the right place. He said that help was at hand. He said that with his help and with the help of medical science, one day I would drink safely again. And I said, "Thank you, doctor." He was my kind of a doctor, that doctor. And the last one in to see me, and the last psychiatrist I have ever seen, with the exception of one I drive to meetings now from time to time, who's not doing too well with this program, by the way. He was fascinated by two things. This gentleman had dubious qualifications and a pronounced Middle European accent. And he was fascinated by my professorial status and the fact that I was wearing sneakers in January. We had a long discussion about the sneakers. He found some mysterious significance there, a relevance that truly had escaped me until he mentioned it. And we had a little discussion, and he popped the question on me. He asked me why I drank so much. I gave him a sexual aberration that drove him out of the room. He thought he had been given a great degenerate to work with, and perhaps he had. Well, I wasn't as smart as I'd like everybody to think, because they had a staff meeting that afternoon, and they discussed Dopey in room 102, and they came to the conclusion that there was a fraud in their hospital, and so they sent for Mrs. O'Keefe, and poor Mrs. O'Keefe had to come up through the snow and the ice, and I was brought into a large room, and she was in the middle of the room hysterical, and she told me that I was in grave danger of being expelled. expelled from a mental institution. I said, let's go, sweetie, out the door. But she prevailed upon me to stay, and she was determined that I would become sober if it was the last dime her father ever made. And I almost did. Well, I went back to where I was staying, and I was then engaged in a Monopoly game with 3 other gentlemen who were there, not for alcoholism. These 3 were just there. They were institutionalized there, and one of them was under the impression that I was his real estate broker. And if you know anything about the game of Monopoly, and some nut thinks you're his real estate broker, you can do very, very well. I had the boardwalk, many hotels. I was doing grand, and I figured I had only a month left of the Monopoly marathon, and I was told I had yet another visitor, and I hadn't expected anyone, so I went in my room and I waited, and through the door of that room came this big, tall, imposing-looking guy, and he told me that he was from the Darien, Connecticut group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that the hospital had asked him to come by and speak to me of this program. And I went right at him. I said, Alcoholics Anonymous? You must be out of your mind. And I started. He told me to shut up. I figured he had not been properly briefed. I shifted gears and I went at him again. He told me to sit down and to shut up and to listen to him. Well, he was a very imposing looking guy, and I was not a well person. And so for the first time in 35 years, I sat and he began to explain to me, as I have tried to indicate to you, and as our book instructs us, what had happened to him, what his life had been like, where alcohol had taken him, how he had come to Alcoholics Anonymous, and how life had been for him since. And he asked me if I would like to go with him to meetings. And I said, you mean outside to meetings? He said, outside. I said, I'll go. Besides that, he gave me matches. No one else had allowed me to have any matches. And I thought that showed a certain degree of confidence in me. And so that's how it began with me. He drove me all over southern Connecticut, and we went every night, and he made arrangements for me to go locally when I came out. And I don't remember all of that so well. I was too new and too nervous and too afraid and too everything, really. And besides, the hospital had turned me loose with a bag of those pills that they insist on giving alcoholics, so my head buzzed a lot. But I know myself fairly well now. I thought I would come to Alcoholics Anonymous. You would recognize me as a superior person. You would elect me your chairman. I was always chairman when I joined something. I would serve a term as your chairman. You would give me a plaque. I would put it on the wall of the shrine. And that's it, onward and upward. Another great chapter written in an already fascinating life. So it should come as no surprise to you, although it was a terrible shock to me, to find some 10 months later I was very drunk. And of course this time I was drunk with a great difference, because I had turned away from the great power that is in this program. And I was to stay drunk for a period of time. And it is and was, without question, the worst period of my life. It was murder. It was pure and simple murder. I never knew when I would drink. I never knew at the beginning of the day where I would be at the end of the day. I never knew when I would be dry. I never knew when I would be drinking. I never knew where I would end up when I drank. And things happened to me in this period of time that had never happened to me before. And I do not speak to you now of things that happened to me in this period of time that I no longer consider to be significant. I do not speak to you now of the fact that I was dismissed from the faculty, fired as a tenured professor of law. I do not speak to you of the fact that I was in serious, and I mean very serious, personal, professional, and financial difficulties. I do not even speak to you of the fact that I lost the affection of all those who were around me. All of that happened to me during this period of time, but that's not what I'm talking about. But I now understand what's happening to me then. I know I could not really see it, but only sense it in those days. That there was, in my case and perhaps in yours, a terrible, terrible wasting of my spirit. My spirit, that thing that separates me from my cat and separates me even from each of you. That individual spark given to me by my Creator to give some type of form to and personality to this particular body I'm in. And that was a spirit which had once burned in me so bright, and it was, even as I was able to observe it, almost gone. And of course the terrible, terrible thing about it was that if I gave this any thought, I thought, there is nothing I can do, because I'd been here. This didn't work for me. And by this time I'd been everywhere else. I've been through the hospitals, I've been through the doctors, I've been through the drying out places, I've been through the jobs and the friends and the money, and I've been through my wife's clergy, and I've been through everything by then. And I didn't think there was anything I could do. I knew about drunks. I knew about drunks. I remembered the neighborhood. I remembered my family. I knew what happened to people like me. I'd been to the funerals. I'd seen it all. And so if I gave it thought, I thought, well, this is the way it is, that's all. This is the way it is, the hell with it. And of course, when you're alcoholic and you're Irish and you're mystical and you think that way, you despair. I despaired, and when I despaired, of course, I drank, and so I continued to drink. And I really didn't think it would end. I really didn't think so. And then one day my time came. My time came one day. My time came. I say to you, and it's only my opinion, that there is a time for all of us. And there is a time for each of us. I say to you that there is a line somewhere beyond which we are simply not permitted to go. And I say to you that there is a point somewhere below which we simply are not allowed to sink. And I say to you that there is a level of pain somewhere beyond which no one is required to endure. Now, I don't know where that line or point is for you. It is different, I think, in each case. We all come to this point in our own way and in our own time. It is an individual thing, but we share it in common. For some, it may be death. And that's the way it was for my brother Billy. A couple of Mays ago, I received a phone call late at night from Fort Snelling that my brother was dying of alcoholism, and he had listed me as the next of kin. And the next morning I got another call that he had died here in Minnesota in the Veterans Hospital at Fort Snelling, where he had been taken from wherever the Skid Row is in Minneapolis. For my brother Billy doesn't drink anymore. Billy hasn't had a drink since that day. And that's how we stopped. So I'm doubly happy to be in Minnesota, because I went by there today. For other people, of course, it can be something very trivial. But wherever it is, the line is there. And I came to that point one day. It was a day that really wasn't much different than any other day. I was in my office. I was very nervous. I was 3 or 4 days away from a drink. I was nervous and thirsty, and I thought I'd have a few pops and see what I could do. I knew I'd felt better if I'd have a few drinks. But instead of doing that, I did something I had never done before. I called a longtime friend of mine who was a longtime member of this program, and his name is John, and he is my sponsor. And I asked him if he'd come over, and of course he came. And John walked into my office, and he looked so good, and I felt so bad. And I asked him what I would have to do to be as successful as he was in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And John gave me that wonderful look that he has, and he said, well, don't drink. Go to meetings. Well, I didn't want him to tell me that, and I told him I didn't want him to tell me that. I told him I was too complicated for that. Very simple, see? Too simple. John gave me the look. You know the look? The look that long-time members of AA reserve for smart-ass people. John, a very patient man, he said, you know, if you don't take one drink for one day, there is no possibility that you will become drunk. Now, wouldn't you think a smart guy like me would have figured that out? I didn't want to hear that either. I said, you see, John, you really don't understand, right? Let me tell you something, John. This place where I work, I got to get out of here. See, this place is really driving me crazy. It's making me drink. He said, well, you don't drink and go to meetings. You'll be all right. I said, thank you for your help, John. I said, now let me tell you about home. Home is worse. I got to get out of there. That's a terrible... So I said, well, don't drink. And you go to meetings. That'll get a little better. And I said, John, you see, I got this trouble with Bankers Trust. I'm going to have to sue Bankers Trust. They're saying very ugly things about me, John. And he said, well, don't drink and go to a meeting. I sensed that there was no dialogue there. And so did John. He made a couple of phone calls, and he took me up to Grand Central, and he stuck me on a train up to Larchmont. It's about a 40-minute ride. And halfway up, I reconsidered. You know, what did I call him for? Who needs him? Don't drink, eh? Don't drink, my ass, don't drink. Wait till this train stops, I show him don't drink. And that was my attitude, and when I got off the train at the Larchmont station, standing on the platform of that station was my mailman, a guy named Al, who was then the chairman of the world-famous Mamaroneck Group. And Al said, "Get in the car." And I said, "Get out of here, Al." Man of my stature, I don't hang around with mailmen. Get out of here. He said, "Some guy called me from New York about you. Get in the car." Well, a man of my stature cannot afford to have a fist fight with a mailman or anybody else, for that matter. So I got in Al's car, and I said, "Al, I'm in a lot of trouble, Al." And Al said, "Well, don't drink. Can you go to the meeting?" I knew I had dropped into the middle of a vast conspiracy. Well, Al took me for a cup of coffee and brought me home, and came back that night and took me to the Mamaroneck Group. And I didn't drink that day, and I haven't had a drink since. And it seems a long time, but it really isn't. But first I had that day. And I had that day because two members of this fellowship were so filled with the gratitude of this fellowship that they took what God sent that day. An arrogant, drunken, dishonest man. And they gave him a day because they were grateful for what they had. And it is, I really hope, that type of gratitude that brings me to St. Paul to be with you. For like all of us, I have a great debt to pay. And this is one of the ways that I do it. Well, after I had that day, I had many days, and I would see John every day, Al every night, and I would get my instructions. And after I've been without drink for a few months, John said to me one day, "You know, Raymond, you're not a bad fellow, and you don't drink, and you hang around the meetings." He said, "It's time you learned something of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Read the book." And because I'm the way I am, I said, "Oh, John, I have read the book. Rarely have we seen anyone fail. It was totally followed." And John gave me the look. And he said, "Read it again." And I said, "Yes, John." Because by then, my sponsor had brought me to the point where I hope your sponsor has brought you, where no matter what he said, I'd say, "Yes, John." So I began to read again the book Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was appalled at my initial ignorance. I thought when first I read the book, well, this is not a particularly well-written book. This was in my capacity as literary critic, and I thought the book had been written by someone who might have had some scholarly or academic type interest in the steps. Give me that thing. Mary Ordaz Molstedt is to call Mrs. McGowan. There is an emergency. Mary Ordaz Molstedt, call Mrs. McGowan. There's an emergency. I thought maybe the book was written by someone who had some vague kind of an academic interest in the topic of alcoholism. I did not then know or appreciate that the book represented the beginnings and was a chronicle of the early members of our fellowship, and that the book was simply a crystallization of their own experiences. I did not understand then, as I now do, that the steps that are written in the 5th chapter of that book were steps literally taken by these men and these women. The first 100 or so men and women who had become sober had taken these steps literally as they had become sober. I thought when first I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, if I told you that my name was Rayok and that I was an alcoholic, I was doing something about the first step of our program. Oh, of course, That's my name, and I'm an alcoholic. But the men and women who founded this program did a great deal more than simply identify themselves as alcoholics. They admitted that they were powerless over alcohol, that their lives had become unmanageable. Their lives were unmanageable because they were powerless over alcohol. It was all the same thing with them. They were powerless. They had no power. They were without power. It says in that book that the dilemma of the alcoholic is his total incapacity for power. He has no power. He is powerless. But they didn't drink, and time began to pass for them. And time has passed for me. And if you come here new, time will pass for you. And time has a way of passing in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It passes one day at a time. And somewhere after this succession of days, we are not told when, these men and these women came to believe in a power greater than their own. And they believed that this power could restore them to sanity. And this was not just a casual observation that they made or an offhand reference that they shared. They believed this. They believed that a power greater than their own could restore them to sanity. And as they believed, I believe. And so firm and so real was that belief that they were able to make the decision that Tony talked of, the decision to turn over their will and their lives to the care of this power that they believed in, this God of their understanding. And they were very, very bright. Because at a time in the history of this country when no one else had this notion, they conceived alcoholism to be a disease. They conceived it to be a disease that was physical and mental and spiritual, a disease of the body and of the mind and of the spirit. And when they stopped drinking, they found that their bodies responded quickly. And when they came to believe that they could be restored to sanity, they began a mental recovery. It was slower than the physical recovery, but it was perceptible. They could notice it, they could see it. And of course, when they made that decision, when they decided to turn over their life, well, that wasn't so very much, because they had already admitted that their lives were unmanageable. But when they made the decision to turn over the will, the alcoholic will, that was the thing that had me in all of that trouble for all of those years. I was, and perhaps I remain, what the book describes, an extreme example of self-will run riot. But when they were able to make that decision to turn over the will to the care of this God of their understanding, when they were finally able to surrender, when they were finally able to let go and to let God, they began not only a spiritual recovery, but they set down a basis for a spiritual way of life to which you and I are heir. They left that to us. That is their legacy to us. And they were smart enough to know, too, that it wasn't enough for them to simply stop drinking and start praying. A lot of people have tried that. It doesn't seem to work. They knew that if they were to be successful, if they were to be sober, somehow they would have to change. And in order to effect this change in themselves, they began a searching and a fearless moral inventory of themselves. They could be searching because by now they were relatively clear. They could be fearless because they had made a decision to turn their lives over to the care of this God of their understanding. Imagine an alcoholic without fear. That's impossible. It embarrasses me to tell you that the ruling emotion of my life when I drank was fear. For all of those years, the great man and the boy professor was afraid most of the time. This program helps with that. And when they were finished with that inventory, so great was the love and the affection of these men and women, one for the other, that they were able to readmit their defects to themselves and to this power that they believed in, and they were able to bring this inventory to someone else and to share it with them. And I did it with my sponsor, and it really helped me. You see, I spent an awful lot of time when I was drinking, standing at that bar, making sure that everybody knew who I was. And I spent just as much time, more, at that bar, making sure nobody knew what I was. And it was a great relief for me to go through this with my sponsor. And then they developed an attitude which really came hard for me because of my willfulness. But they became entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And with compelling logic, they went to this power that they believed in, this God of their understanding, and they humbly asked that power to remove their shortcomings. And it worked. And no matter what else history may say of you and of our fellowship and of our efforts, the one thing they must tell and must accept is the simple proposition that it works. And they knew, these men and women, that they had not come here alone. They knew that in their lives, as in mine, there was a certain amount of wreckage. So they wrote a list of everyone they had ever harmed, and they became willing to make amends to everyone on the list. And then they did it. They just didn't talk about it. They went out and they did it. And you may remember the last day that Dr. Bob drank, he had a couple of beers with Bill in the morning, and he took out some kids' tonsils. And he got home late that night, and Bill asked him where he'd been. And he said he was driving around Akron, Ohio in an old Buick. He was mending some fences, he said. It's an old Vermont expression. He was making amends. First day he was dry. And I don't think we need wait too long in our program to do whatever it is that's expected of us. Well, by this time, these men and women were pretty sober. And they knew that whatever had been given to them was something very precious, and so they resolved that they would maintain it. And in order to maintain it, they continued to take personal inventory. I think they did that on a daily basis. They knew they could not enjoy the luxury of a resentment. They could not be hateful. They knew that if they were resentful, if they were hateful, they would die because they would drink. It was simple with them. And so when they were wrong, they promptly admitted that they were wrong. And so great and so real and so true was their reliance upon this power greater than their own, this God of their understanding, that they resolved that they would improve their conscious contact with this power And they did that by prayer and by meditation. They meditated. They gave thought to their condition. They considered who they were and what they were. And then they engaged in a very, very fine form of meditation. It is a form of meditation in which you are now engaged. They listened. They listened on the odd chance that this power that they believed in would speak to them. And this power that they believed in did speak to them in their groups, at their meetings. And then they prayed, brothers. They prayed. And no one needs a sermon from me on the value of prayer. When they prayed only for knowledge of God's will for them and the power to carry that out. And a little later they came upon a prayer that they thought would help them, and so they appropriated it. And this time they prayed for themselves, and the only thing they asked was peace of mind. And so they asked God to grant them the serenity to accept the things they could not change. And they did change. Something happened to them. Something has happened to me. Something happens to everyone who comes here and puts this program into their lives. There was a great difference between being drunk and being sober. There was a great difference in their lives. There was a great substitution of their standards and a great conversion of their values. And this difference in them, the difference between being drunk and being sober, they termed a spiritual awakening. And they had this spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. And these were the men and the women who at the beginning of this process had admitted that they were hopeless and helpless and powerless. These were the ones who had no power. But having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, they found that they held in their hands and in their hearts and in our program one of the greatest sources of spiritual power that the world has ever seen. They actually had the power to arrest the disease of alcoholism. They actually had the power to save life. And the only thing they were using was the great power of example of one drunk for another. And armed with that power, and having had that kind of a spiritual awakening, they began to carry the message to the alcoholic. And they did that so well that you and I have come together on a night in March in 1977 in the great capital city of St. Paul, Minnesota. And that my dear, dear brothers, is a long, long way from Akron, Ohio. And they knew what my sponsor knew. They knew what my friend Buck knows, that there is a great deal more to our program than a simple device to keep me from drinking like a pig. They knew that what had been given to them was an entirely new way of living. And in order to preserve and to protect and to enjoy that new way of living, they resolved that they would practice the principles of this program in all their affairs. And so, where they had been, as I always was, dishonest, they tried to be honest. Where they had been, as I ever was, arrogant, they tried not to be so arrogant. Happily for me and us was read to us before the proceedings. They said we need not be saints. They said we do not claim spiritual perfection. We claim only spiritual progress. And my sponsor told me that I could progress in this program if I didn't drink and if I went to the meetings. I could keep you for many, many more minutes and tell you of all of the good things that have happened to me, wholly and solely and simply because I am a member of this fellowship. But I want to go to the dance. I know that if you have a good wish for me, and I'm sure you do, no matter what you might wish for me, please be assured it has probably already happened in my life, wholly and simply because I am a member of the world-famous Mamaroneck Group. They always make me say world-famous whenever I say Mamaroneck Group. I want to thank you all for the invitation here. I will be at the world-famous Mamaroneck Group tomorrow, briefly, because I have to go somewhere else at night. But I will be there, and I will report to them, as they expect, of my visit here with you. I will tell them how warm and friendly you have been to me, and that for the time that I have been with you, you have made me comfortable and made me feel at home. And I will bring your wishes and good wishes to that group. And believe me, if that group approves of your weekend, you have nothing to fear. I am one of those members of Alcoholics Anonymous who are privileged to go all over the country dragging this sad story behind me, and everywhere I go, I end the same way. It is from one of our pamphlets. It is a pamphlet that is dear to me. It's called The Member's View of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in that pamphlet, at the end, the author takes a biblical turn, and he reminds us once again of the time when John the Baptist was languishing in one of Herod's prisons. Anyhow, this pamphlet says that John the Baptist was languishing in one of Herod's prisons, and John sent two of his friends to inquire of his cousin Jesus as to whether or not he was the Messiah. And so these two men found the Lord, and they walked with him a while, and they finally asked him the question. They asked him if he were the Messiah. They asked him if he were the Messiah, or should they wait for another. The Lord really didn't answer that question, but he said to these two men, go back to John and tell John only what you have seen and only what you have heard. Tell John that the lame walk and that the blind see tell John that the sick are made well and that the poor have the gospel brought to them. In my early training, I was told that the word poor in that context could mean poor in spirit. And of course, everyone knows that the word gospel simply means good news. And so, my brothers at St. Paul, if you will accept a report from me based upon my years in Alcoholics Anonymous, I will tell you only what I have heard and only what I have seen. And based on that observation, it seems to me that the lame do walk and the blind do see, and most certainly the sick are made well. And I have seen over and over and over again, through the longest day and into the darkest nights, the good news of this program brought to the alcoholic who still suffers, the poor in spirit. Thank you.